Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, your host, and today we'll be sampling beers from Scotland's oldest and largest brewery, Belhaven. Now, the history of Belhaven goes back at least a few hundred years to 1719 when the brewery was allegedly founded. And it's named after the village of Belhaven, in which it's based, which is an outlying village of the town of Dunbar in Scotland, which itself is located about 30 miles or 50 kilometers east of Edinburgh. And also historically, the village of Belhaven was sort of the port village of the town of Dunbar. Now, I say that the brewery was allegedly founded in 1719 because we don't know exactly what happened. What we do know is that in that year, the local government of the town, or burgh, or borough, raised taxes on breweries to pay for local improvements. And in that exact year, we have records of a brewery setting up shop in the town of Belhaven, which is incidentally just outside the town limits of Dunbar. So it would seem that there probably was a brewery, whose name is now lost to history, where the owners picked up shop, moved outside of town, and set up shop again to avoid paying those pesky public improvement taxes. Now, that's just a theory, but it's probably the right theory. But the brewers were on their A game, because by the mid-1800s, Belhaven was one of just 3 breweries left in the greater Dunbar region, and by the mid-20th century, after World War II, Belhaven was the only brewery standing. And it seems the secret, like the secret of so many other successful breweries, is that the guys running Belhaven really knew how to scale their operations and brew beer that was not only good, but in larger volume than the competition. And they sort of continued with this trend, whereby in 2005, after some additional expansion, Belhaven became not only the oldest, but also the largest brewery in all of Scotland. I remember first trying Belhaven actually when I was at a whiskey pub and bar in New York City on the Upper East Side called Caledonia. And in addition to the pub having 250 different types of whiskey and scotch, they also had some Belhaven beer, and me being me, I tried some of the beer, which was very nice. But I gotta say, while I do enjoy a good whiskey, and especially I enjoy a good scotch, unfortunately this is not really the particular channel on which to talk about the finer points of whiskey and scotch, so I will refrain from doing so. Unless you would like me to talk about that stuff, which I can do in a totally unrelated set of videos. Let me know in the comments. So, what's Belhaven up to these days? Well, in 2012, the brewery underwent a massive refurbishment process where a lot of the older tools and machinery were kind of reworked so that the brewing process could produce sort of a wider range of beers. And then the reopening of the brewery in 2013 was actually quite an event, and it was attended by Princess Anne. And for those of you who don't know, Princess Anne is the daughter of Elizabeth II and the recently and dearly departed Prince Philip. See, up until the 2010s, Belhaven just didn't produce things like lagers. But after the retooling process, the brewers could now start experimenting with sort of much wider variety of beers. Belhaven has now experimented with lagers, blonde ales, and even what they have called American IPAs, which is quite ironic given the origin of IPAs. But nonetheless, things like Scotch ales and porters still very much remain the company's primary specialty. And remember, while lagers are seen as sort of classic beers, they're a fairly new invention in the scheme of things. And I also tend to think of the British Isles as really having the strongest tradition of brewing things like porters, stouts, bitters, and Scotch ales, not so much lagers. Traditions which, thank God, are still alive and well. Belhaven, as befitting Scotland's largest brewery by volume, is of course the largest exporter of Scottish beer. The main markets for Belhaven beer include the United States, France, Sweden, and Russia. And also, beer made by the brewery consists of only Scottish barley. And as befitting Scotland's oldest brewery and one of the oldest breweries in Britain, this actual Belhaven primary structure is listed as a Category A building in Scotland. And what Category A means is it's basically a building of national or international importance. Now, there are about 3,700 Category A structures, so a fair number, but nonetheless, it's a good list to be on. And also, Belhaven has 150 different pubs in the UK, which may not seem like a lot, but I think that's a pretty good number. And also, you gotta remember, there are a lot of pubs in the UK. And no, I don't think that's a bad thing. Scottish ale. This is a copper-colored ale that's going to have sort of a rich, biscuity, malty flavor to it with a little bit of hops mixed in. It's got 2 different types of malt, crystal malt and black malt, as well as 2 different types of hops. So overall, this should give it sort of a sweet, malty flavor with just a little bit of bitterness. Wee Heavy. The Wee Heavy, if you can't guess, is going to be a more sort of strong, full-bodied beer, with alcohol content to match, 7.4% ABV to be exact. This beer is going to have notable sweetness to it because of the cane sugar and caramel used in the brewing process, and it's also going to have some notes of sort of spicy fruitiness because of the type of hop used. Black Scottish Stout. As befitting a stout, this beer is going to have a dark, rich texture to it. It's made from a mash that includes roasted barley, oats, and plenty of malt, and that's really going to bring out those sort of heavy, coffee, chocolatey flavors one would expect from a good stout. Let's taste some Scottish beers, shall we? First up, we have the Belhaven Scottish Ale. I would indeed describe that as a copper color, amber color. Yep, I'm getting some malt flavor in this. Yeah, it's very nice. It's not overly strong, actually. For some reason, it has the foundation of a beer that I would expect would have a very high sort of alcohol content to it. Like it's sort of got those legs, but it doesn't really have the punch. And I'm just looking here, it says it's 5.2% by volume, which sort of tastes about right for this. There's a good complexity to it, but it's still sort of in the range of being like a very good quality regular beer. It's not sort of one of those extra strength turbo beers. Maltiness that's kind of, I think, it's sort of underneath a lot of that. It's sort of, the maltiness is kind of there in the background, and it gives the beer a nice sort of full flavor, which I really appreciate. It doesn't feel thin at all. It feels like there's nice full flavor to it. We're off to a very good start. Belhaven. Let's move on to the next beer. But actually, while we're moving on to the next beer, we will actually be moving on to the same beer, just in a can. So I've not done this before. I've talked a couple of times about sort of I'm not a huge fan of beer in cans, but I saw these both next to each other. Originally I thought I was getting a different type of Belhaven. Turned out I actually just got the Scottish Ale again, but I got it in a can versus this in a bottle. So I haven't done this yet, but I want to try it. I want to try this from a can and see if it tastes any different from the Belhaven Ale in a bottle. So here we go. This has a completely different pour to it. By virtue of being in the can, this beer's settling in a very different way now. Before, this was a very sort of your characteristic kind of, reasonably carbonated, kind of bubbly head. This now is a much more creamy head to it. This almost tastes like a different beer in a can rather than in a bottle. This is way more smooth. It's a lot smoother. I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm getting a rather different flavor profile on this beer rather than this beer. And I do wonder then how much of a difference the bottle versus the can has on these beers and sort of the flavor profiles that you're getting from them. It has rich in both cases. I would say it classifies as rich in both cases. Here, the nuttiness comes through a lot more. Here, the smoothness comes through a lot more. So I gotta say, having done this now, I'm really starting to rethink in how many situations I should be trying beer that's allegedly the same, considering what it tastes like in a bottle versus what it tastes like in a can, and seeing if this pattern of different flavor profiles, depending on how the beer is stored, carries through. And it makes sense. You've got different containers made out of completely different substances, glass versus metal. Yeah, no, they taste different. This is more, the notes are sharper in this one. This is more dry, a little bit more hoppy, and a little bit more nutty. This is much more smooth, and I suppose the same flavors are there, but imagine here you just muted them. So next we have the Wee Heavy. Yes, so this is much darker. That was sort of a copper color. This is a deep, deep reddish brown. When I think of sort of a Scotch ale or a Scottish ale, this style, this is exactly what I think of when I think of a Scotch ale, and it's quite good beer. I quite enjoy this flavor. It's got that, unlike with these which are lower in alcohol, it's got that higher alcohol feel. This one's 7.4, and it's very it's there. So it's got that sort of higher alcohol kind of underbite to it. It's almost like the beer version of like rum or something. But of course, while still having all of those beer elements. Whereas now that it's finished on my palate, it's a lot more sort of like dry, slightly spicy sort of fruit flavors. which is very interesting. And yeah, all of this I would say, yeah, very characteristic of a Scotch ale, as the style would be called. So next we have Black Scottish Stout. All right. There is ever so slightly a little bit of light coming in at the bottom on this. I mean, some stouts and porters I've seen are truly just midnight black. I wouldn't say I'm super impressed. So here's the thing, it's fine. It's a perfectly drinkable stout. But the thing about it is, I don't think there's a ton of flavor in this. Now again, maybe it's because it's in the can and I should have it in a bottle, or I don't know. And I'm sure this is the kind of beer where, frankly, on tap, name of the channel, right? On tap, this is, I'm sure, gonna be the best. Like, well, I mean, any beer is gonna be better that way. But this is not, there's not much going on here. If I'm talking about a stout, I want something that's got some strength to it. And not even just alcohol, but just something that just feels very full and, rich and creamy. And, in the case of a stout, maybe, bitter kind of coffee flavors. Yeah, so I wouldn't describe it as particularly rich or creamy or strong. It feels a little thin, honestly. I can't really taste much in the way of coffee or chocolate or, roasted oats or roasted kind of anything. It just sort of tastes like, kind of a very, very, very mild stout. So this conclusion is going to be pretty straightforward. In last place is definitely the Belhaven Black. It's very thin. It doesn't have really much flavor to it, and there are much better stouts out there. I personally would pass on this. Starting with these here, the Scottish ales, I thought both of these are quite good. Again, I get it's the same beer, but as I said, the Scottish ale in the bottle versus the Scottish ale in the can do have slightly different flavor profiles. Both of them are quite good, and I think they would be perfectly suitable in sort of a bar or a pub situation. So yeah, this is a good beer. It's definitely something you could, have sort of a couple of and not kind of think too much about it, but there's just a little bit extra sort of complexity to it, especially this one, again, with sort of the, very, very, very mild sweetness, but sort of some maltiness and a little bit of sharp, all kind of mixed together. Makes it quite easy to drink. And then this is gotta be in first place, the Wee Heavy. Really what I think of when I think of just a good Scotch ale, and especially I like the sweetness, sort of the blend of the higher alcohol content with that sort of sugarcane taste, but it's not like a sickly sweet, it's just sort of, it's like a nice sort of, almost like a rum sweet. That's my assessment, pretty easy, 1, 2, 3. The only thing here with the two going together is I think this depends on what style of the Scottish ale you'd prefer. If you prefer your Scottish ale to be a bit more mellow, maybe look for it in the can. If you prefer to be a bit more notable with more clear notes and more clear flavor profiles, then go for it in the bottle. So anyway, that is my ranking of the at least 3, let's call it 3.5 Belhaven beers. Yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments. Curious to get your thoughts. Always keep it civil, and I'll see you next time.